Welcome to another webinar from the League of Women Voters. I'm Catherine Bealey, President of the Utah League, and we'll be breaking down the pros and cons of two ballot measures around education funding. Please use the Q&A to ask questions of our presenters, and we'll get to them as we can. Now I'd like to turn this over to our moderator, Robert Gehrke of the Salt Lake Tribune. Robert?
Thanks, Catherine. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. This is an important issue. It's one that maybe hasn't got as much attention as some of the other constitutional amendments, but I am glad everybody's here to learn a little bit more about it and help make an informed, educated decision. It's an important issue for the state going forward. Tonight, our panel includes Andrea Brandley, who's the Senior Education Policy Analyst at the Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. We have Dixie Heufner, who's on the steering committee of Utah Citizens Council. It's a nonpartisan coalition of seniors who take positions on policy issues. We have Billy Hesterman, a longtime friend of mine and a colleague, and he's now president of the Utah Taxpayers Association. Stepped into that last month after a career in lobbying. And we have Renée Pinkney, who is the president of the Utah Education Association. So we're going to give each of them an opportunity to give a short presentation, starting with Andrea, who's going to kind of just run us through the nuts and bolts of how this would function. And then we'll move through the lineup. And as Catherine mentioned, there is the chat that you can put in your questions that we'll hopefully take plenty of at the end. I've always found the questions can be more enlightening sometimes than presentations. No offense, guys, but we'll begin with you, Andrea. We'll let you get started.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So as Robert mentioned, my focus will just be on providing key information on the constitutional change in Amendment A on the ballot. As the Gardner Institute, we don't take positions on this in any one way or the other, but just hope to shed some light and help people understand the amendment so that they can make an informed decision when they vote in November. So I'm going to just briefly go through what the proposed amendment is, focusing on Amendment A, and then do a brief overview of the income tax to help understand the impacts a little more, the history of the income tax earmark and how that relates to education funding in our state, talk briefly about the two companion bills with this amendment, and then just walk through some frequently asked questions to hopefully help all of us understand this amendment and be able to make an informed decision when we vote. So starting with the proposed amendment. So what you see on your screen here is the actual constitutional language. What is shown in black is what currently is in the Utah Constitution, and then the red italics show the what is proposed to be added. So currently the Constitution earmarks all income tax revenue to be used to support public and higher education or services for children and individuals with a disability. The proposed amendment adds essentially two big components. The first is it embeds the requirement to maintain a public education framework within the Constitution itself. So the framework lives in statute, but the requirement to have the framework would live in the Constitution. The framework needs to address student enrollment, long-term inflation, and provide a budgetary stabilization account, or essentially a rainy day account for public education. And currently that already exists in statute. This just makes the requirement to have that embedded in the Constitution. And then the second portion that would be added would be the allowance of using income tax revenue for other state needs, or essentially any public purpose, once the public education funding framework requirement has been met. So just to kind of help level set, I want to talk briefly about income tax revenue in our state. This graph here is showing Utah state and local tax revenue by source, and you can see in red, 35% of Utah state and local tax revenue comes from income taxes. It is the largest revenue source, followed closely by state and local sales taxes, which make up 33% of the tax portfolio. However, this has not always been the case. So this graph is showing the same thing you saw on the previous slide, but for a long 100-year history. So if we go back all the way to 1920, it used to be that 100% of state and local tax revenue came from property taxes because that was the only tax we had. This has, of course, changed through time, and you can see in red the income tax revenue making up a larger and larger share of the state tax portfolio over the last 100 years. We also see that income tax revenue has grown at a more rapid rate than the other major tax revenues in the state of Utah. So you can see both the red lines are the individual income and corporate income tax rates, and you'll see that they've grown at a much faster rate than the state sales and use tax and motor vehicle and fuel tax. So those two taxes shown in red make up the income revenue that goes to the income tax fund. The other two taxes go to the general fund and transportation fund. So this is just important to understand that the revenue driving the income tax fund has been growing and growing and growing, while the revenue funding the general fund and the transportation fund has grown at a much slower rate or even declined in the case of the motor vehicle and fuel tax. So this presents some budget flexibility challenges for lawmakers. So just to talk briefly about the history of the earmark, this earmark has existed in some form for almost 100 years. I'll just go through the bigger highlights of this timeline and not go through every portion, but the earmark was first enacted in 1931. And at this time, it was 75% of income tax revenue was required to go to public education. The other 25% would be deposited into the general fund and could be used for education, but could also be used for other purposes. This then changed in 1947 to 100% of the income tax revenue being earmarked for public education. And this is the longest lasting version of this earmark that we've had in the state. That lasted for 50 years, from 1947 to 1997. At this point, the Constitution was amended to add higher education to that earmark. So for the last 25 to 30 years, we've been funding both higher education and public education could be funded with income tax revenue. And then the most recent change came from Amendment G in 2020 and took effect in 2021. This added the ability to use income tax revenue for services for children and for people with disabilities, and is the current constitutional language we have today. And then, of course, as you see on the timeline, 2024 brings the current amendment we are discussing, where income tax revenue could be used for any purpose once those certain school funding provisions are met. So this graph is showing the use of income tax revenue for that same time period from 1931 to 2024. So this kind of helps us see what happened in practice as those amendments were added. You can see at the very beginning, 75% is red going to public ed, with that 25% going to the state general fund. And then you see this huge block of red for 50 years in the middle, showing all of income tax revenue going to public education. But then starting in 1997, you see a portion of that revenue in gray. So that gray is going to higher education. You see that kind of, fluctuates through time, but generally gets bigger and bigger as time progresses. And then you will see just the last few years, a little bit in black, showing the share that's going to children and people with disabilities. So the share of income tax revenue going to public education has been generally declining since these amendments have been added. I do think that it's important to acknowledge that this is showing the share of income tax revenue in each year. The amount of revenue to be split amongst these things, of course, changes from year to year, and as we saw previously, has generally been growing. So this doesn't mean that education has received less funding overall, but it has received a smaller share of the income tax revenue. That is shown more clearly here. This graph is showing total per student funding from 2000 to present. And you see for most of the last 25 years, this has been increasing, besides the decrease we saw post-Great Recession. But for the last 10 to 15 years, it has increased through time. And this is both education funding as a whole and also per student, because we have seen enrollment growth for most of the last 25 years. And even with that enrollment growth, that total per student funding has increased. And even when we adjust for inflation, that funding has increased. I do think, though, that it's also important to acknowledge that Utah's education expenditures as a percentage of personal income, so this is a common metric used when measuring education spending effort, that has decreased through time. So it was 5.1% in 2002, and we ranked 16th among states. That's dropped to 3.5% as of 2022, which is the most recent data, and our ranking has dropped from 16th to 40th. And then I just wanted to talk briefly through the two companion bills, as I know those are not the focus of our webinar today, but I think they're just important to be aware of. One of them was HB 394, Hold Harmless for Public Education Enrollment. And both of these bills that I will discuss have already passed the legislature and will take effect come January 1 if the amendment passes. So this particular companion bill says that certain public education funding would not decline, even if enrollment drops in future years. This is important because public education funding is very closely tied to enrollment counts and to per pupil amounts. And we do anticipate over the next 10 years that enrollment will drop. So this is essentially saying that even though enrollment will drop, education spending can't drop. So in theory, that money would stay at least flat, if not increasing, would be split among fewer students as enrollment declines, driving up per student spending. The second companion bill is HB 54. This one, I think, is the one talked about more often and repeals the state portion of sales tax on food. There's currently a 3% sales tax on food. 1.75% comes from the state. The other 1.25% is local. The local one would remain in place. The 1.75% coming from the state would be repealed. These graphs show just an analysis we did of the benefit by household income decile. I don't have time to dive into that analysis right now, but I will put a link to our policy brief in the chat so that if you're interested in that analysis, you can take a look at that at a later point. And then finally, I just want to talk briefly through some frequently asked questions we get, because I think it's a little bit easier to understand when I talk in a more casual way, talking through those questions. The first is, to what extent does the current constitutional earmark guarantee funding for K-12 education? This is a very nuanced question. However, the way that the language is currently stated, the only thing that is guaranteed is that income tax revenue goes to public ed, higher ed, or children and people with disabilities. In theory, the legislature could choose to give all of it to public ed, all of it to higher ed, all of it to individuals with disabilities. There's no requirement for an amount specifically to go to K-12 education funding, and there's no requirement that there is a certain level of income tax revenue at all. So even with current constitutional language, the legislature could choose to cut income tax rates or cut the income tax altogether, at which point K-12 education funding has no guarantee from this current constitutional earmark, which leads us to ask, the same question for the proposed language, if that guarantees K-12 education funding. Again, there's not a strong guarantee with the proposed amendment. There's a slightly bigger guarantee in that funding framework is embedded in the Constitution. However, again, no levels are required. It's just that the framework exists is required, and then the actual funding levels and how it's adjusted lives in statute, which can, of course, be more easily changed in the Constitution itself. And then when it comes to higher education funding, essentially the earmark just impacts which fund higher education is receiving their money from, but not necessarily the amount of funding they receive. So they used to receive all their funding from the general fund. Now they receive a portion of it from the income tax fund, and that portion has been increasing over the years. Recently, almost all of higher education funding has come from the income tax fund. But again, it doesn't require any sort of levels, just kind of impacts which fund the money comes from. And then finally, can the legislature use income tax revenue to pay for roads? The answer is currently no, not directly. However, as I just discussed, higher education receives some funding from the income tax fund, some from the general fund. So they could say, well, this portion that we're giving higher ed from the general fund, let's instead give it to them from the income tax fund. Now the money we saved from the general fund, we can use to pay for roads. So there can be money shifted between accounts in order to get roads paid for, even though they're not directly paid for through income tax revenue. And then the final question is removing the constitutional earmark the only alternative to maintain budget flexibility? The answer to that is no. There are other options that the legislature or others could pursue. I don't have time to walk through all of them in this presentation, but again, if you're interested in that, you can find that in our policy brief. So I will stop there and pass it back to Robert. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And I'll put a link to Andrea's policy brief in the chat as well. Reminder, if you have questions, the chat room is open. So there we go. Andrea's already put it in there. So if you have questions, the chat room is open. We'll address those at the end. But Dixie, do you want to go next?
I'll take it from there. Thank you for that very nice overview that you've just presented, Andrea. And I'm just going to highlight 5 basic reasons why the Utah Citizens Council is uncomfortable with Amendment A and why it is opposing it. And the first item, which Peggy's going to put up on the screen for me, is that Amendment A actually removes a constitutional mandate that was intended to safeguard and enhance public school funding. It's much more than a statutory earmark. It's a constitutional mandate. And it removes, as you've seen, a longstanding constitutional right that prioritized the state's role in educating its future workforce, its children. It was meant to protect education from legislative wheeling and dealing. So that's number 1. And then number 2, we see it as a power grab. That Amendment A allows the legislature to spend income tax revenues on whatever else it wants to prioritize besides education, which includes pet projects and its favored groups. And the legislature would like more flexibility, yes, and it says it needs it. But I want you to realize that it handcuffs itself by not removing statutory earmarks that it has created. And I think that, and I got this from Andrea's policy brief, that about 25% of sales tax revenue is currently tied up in earmarks that the legislature created. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is the ballot language itself has holes in it. And the language stating that it prioritizes covering enrollment growth and inflation masks 2 facts that are on the next 2 slides. The first one is important. It hides the fact that simply funding enrollment growth, if it occurs, and inflationary cost increases as they occur, doesn't fund the need to increase the quality of public education itself in increasingly complex times. Utahns have way above average classroom sizes still. We could do a lot more to better fund preschool programs in the public schools. We could scale up mental health counselors and nurses. We have way too few for the number of children being served. We could keep increasing teacher salaries in a way to get them closer to what other professionals earn when they graduate from college. We could do a better job of reaching our English language learners who are growing to be a bigger percentage of our school population. So there are lots of needs to increase the quality of public education that aren't part of this quote guarantee, which really isn't a guarantee, which leads to the next slide, which is about the ballot language itself, because it obscures the fact that the proposed constitutional amendment, which the ballot language no longer has to explain impartially now that the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate get to write it instead of the Office of Ledge Research and General Counsel. But this ballot language obscures the fact that it's only has to spend an undefined portion of revenue growth on inflationary increases and enrollment growth. Portion is undefined. It could be $1. It could be $5 or $10. It could be a very small portion. It's not defined. And in a bad year, if we don't have economic growth, then it's up for grabs. Who's going to get the results of the wheeling and dealing that goes on in terms of how the money can be spent? So who might lose out? That's just not clear. And the next slide is duplicating somewhat what Andrea put up, because she put up the left-hand side showing you the actual proposed change to the Constitution that will actually occur if voters approve Amendment A. But the language that's been put out so far to appear on the ballot doesn't describe all that. It's much simpler and says the Constitution can be used for all state needs and to prioritize public funding for changes in enrollment and inflation. And I've already explained how that's really pretty vague and unclear as to what that would result in. And then you can see tacked on to the ballot language is if the amendment is approved, the state statute will eliminate the state sales tax on food, which I want to talk about in the next slide. So there we have it. The state portion of the sales tax, 1.75%, will be removed, but will take effect only if Amendment A passes. So in other words, the legislature is trying to lure voters into voting for something that's against the public's interest. I think we should be smarter than this, and that the food tax and Amendment A itself should be separate. They should not be linked, because who wants to be like the mouse that lets the cheese tempt it into the mousetrap? And that's what we see this as. Okay, now our fifth reason for not liking this amendment deals with vouchers. Creating scholarships up to $8,000 per student, eligible students, to take to private schools, including religious schools, comes with no accountability and virtually no transparency about how the money is actually being spent by all these individual students and their parents. It's being paid for out of income tax funds. So it's creating a dual system of income tax funded public and private education, removing millions of dollars from public schools every year. 82.5 million has been taken from income tax for this first coming year of these scholarships, with more anticipated monetary divisions to come. And UCC says to itself, what's happening to the separation of church and state? And we thought that public funds were for public education, public schools. And we have a lot of concern about funding voucher scholarships out of income tax money. So my final thought in way of a finale is that creating these $8,000 scholarships, let's get the last slide up here so you can actually see it, is that doing that and voting for Amendment A is a mistake. Voting no will tell the legislature that it needs to reconsider its budgeting options and what it wants to fund with what sources, and let the income tax revenue to continue to prioritize the critical role the state plays in creating better opportunities for the 90% of Utah's K-12 students who go to public school to learn together and to work together for their collective betterment and that of their families, communities, and the state. So please vote no on Amendment A.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Dixie. Hopefully what you picked up on so far is how intricate the state budget is. I mean, all of these different pots of money and so forth. And And what it comes down to, I guess, is budgets are talk about our priorities. That's what Joe Biden said once upon a time, I guess, is don't tell me your priorities, show me your budget, and I'll tell you your priorities. So, Billy, as the Taxpayer Association president, I know your organization is supporting Amendment A. Can you tell us a little bit about the counter argument, I guess, to what Dixie just laid out for us?
Sure. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone, for participating tonight and being with us. It's lovely to be with people that are interested in the issues and want to talk about them and learn from each other. I will give this up front. My wife is a public high school teacher. She teaches in the Jordan School District. My 3 kids all go to schools in the Jordan District. So I care about the education system. I care about how our students are treated, how our teachers are treated. I certainly want to see our system be one of the best in the country. And I believe we're heading in that direction. I want to start with an analogy of why we support what's being considered here. I want you to think of someone building a house. They're going to need lots of things to accomplish that. They need wood, they need tools, they need cement, they need all the different things that you need to put this together, and they need it available to them at the right time in the right places. Now imagine that someone came up to that person building your house and said, well, you can use your hammer and your screwdriver, but only when you're working in the bathroom. We know that that is a very important part of this house, probably one of the most important pieces of this house. And you can only use those 2 very important tools in the bathroom. For the rest of the house, you've got to figure something else out. And that's how we see what's going on right now with the state budget. We've asked lawmakers to create a $29 billion state budget, and that we are limiting their ability to fund everything that the state wants to provide. Just like we're taking that hammer and that screwdriver and saying, you can only use it for the bathroom. We're saying you can only use one source of money or revenue for the state for one particular need within the state. And so we would like to see the opportunity for lawmakers to have some flexibility opened up to them. Now, granted, they've had it to a point where they've allowed higher ed to be a part of the income tax fund, and then also now, programs funding children and those with disabilities. So there are some flexibilities that are being added. So maybe now they're saying, well, you can also fund, you can also build the bathroom, and maybe we'll let you do the kitchen sink. But there's still more that those tools can accomplish, and be flexible to allow people to build a house and build a budget that is sustainable, that is impactful, and that is strong, and is something that we can be proud of. And that's what we're looking for, is allowing lawmakers to have the flexibility they need to move the money to where it's most needed. I think most people can agree when they've gone to hear a legislator candidate speak, that one of the very first things that they will talk about is how important our education system is in the state. I don't believe that if we remove any type of earmark, or maybe you could call them handcuffs on the budget, that the lawmakers all of a sudden are going to ignore education and not fund it to the proper levels that it needs, because then they would be voted out. They would not have the job that they were willing to put their name on a sign for, and to ask their neighbors and friends to vote for them. And so that's what we're really talking about here, is how do we allow them to make the best decision possible? And I believe that they still will. That education is still the #1 priority in this state. I love that we've talked about our workforce and our children. I agree. We need to give them the best opportunity to be the most well-educated, be put in a position for them to succeed, to fill the jobs that are going to be needed in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's going to be felt by the business community coming to the legislature and saying, we need you to do this. It's going to be felt from the teachers and the parents saying, we need you to do this. And so I don't believe that the political pressure will be there to say, don't fund the kids. We want you to build bigger roads. We want you to make sure that our state parks have soda flowing out of the water fountains and hot tubs at every single state park. We're going to continue to see funding for our education in this state if this passes. And I think even at greater levels. It's often said doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And I do believe that that is something that we're seeing here. We often hear about how Utah's education levels are not at the level that they need to be at, but yet we're holding on to the same things that we've always held on to for a number of years now. It's maybe time to try something different. It might be time to give it a shot, to give a little more trust of the lawmakers and the legislature to, really show us that they can, if given the flexibility, do the right things. I would also note that I believe this adds a lot of transparency to the budget. As has been noted already, we do see the games that are played with the budget where they do go, well, we'll fund higher ed a little less out of the general fund so that we can free up money here. I believe by having this earmark taken away, we're going to see a full transparency on how the money is spent and not see the shell games being played of which money gets spent where. And I think that's important for the taxpayers so that they know and can hold their legislators accountable when they go to the ballot box, how the money's being spent, where it's being spent. And if they don't like it, I often say, then you have the opportunity to vote the bums out. And so I think that that's what we need to remember, is that if we're not happy with what's happening, we have that chance every 2 years to make a decision on those elections to make sure that they know what it is we want to have happen. Elections are supposed to have consequences. I believe they do. And I believe that allowing this amendment to go forward will make sure we have the best outcomes for our state.
All right, thank you, Billy. We'll wrap up with Renee. Just a reminder again for everybody tuning in, if you do have questions, the chat room is open. We'll have probably 45 minutes to go through those at the end. So, but first we'll hear from Renee and you can take it from there, Renee. Thanks. You might be muted.
And that's not letting me do that. Hello, everyone. I'm just getting my presentation up. Thank you for bearing with me. And now I don't see it. Well, let me try one more time. And if not, I may need to ask. There we go. I've got it. Thank you for giving me just a minute to get that put together. Okay, I am Renée Pinkney, and I am speaking to you as the president of Utahns for Student Success. And we have a campaign to vote against Amendment A. And we know that 90% of our children attend public schools, and we truly believe that every child, no matter their color, their background, where they live, they deserve to attend a school with a highly qualified educator in a well-resourced classroom, in a school that is safe, that is welcoming, and that fosters a strong sense of belonging. And bottom line, we want our kids to thrive. We want them to reach their full potential. And we know that that takes funding. We have yet to realize a fully funded public education system. And Utahns for Student Success, we are a coalition that is very broad. We have Republicans, Democrats, independents, teachers, parents, many different groups who are very concerned about what would happen if Constitutional Amendment A passed. So I want to situate us in time. I want to go back to January 2023 when HB 215 passed, and keeping in mind that it became public on January 16th, it was signed into law on January 28th. And that was 12 days, right? And it was a very undemocratic process. I believe it was a power grab. And the Salt Lake Tribune asked, what's next? Well, what was next was trying to fund this new program that they created. And they started with $40 million out of the income tax fund. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say you can use $40 million out of the income tax fund for a voucher program. So at the end of the session in 2023, they passed SJR 10, which basically created this Constitutional Amendment A to open up the income tax to all state needs. So we're going fast forward 1 year to January 2024. And in January 2024, on the 26th, Senator Collimore asked for an appropriations of $150 million for the voucher program to expand it. It hadn't even started yet. And he identified the funding source as the income tax fund. So they're telling us what they're going to do. They're going to keep expanding this voucher program. And we know that that has not gone well in Arizona. And the fact that Arizona has tried to create this dual education system, a voucher program and public education, they've almost bankrupted Arizona, the budget. And so this is very problematic. And then in April 26, 2024, there was a title here, National Award for Juan Diego, Catholic High School Principal. And it was in recognition of getting the voucher program passed, about HB 215. This is a national effort that we're seeing across the country in order to establish voucher programs. And when I hear our legislators say education is the top priority, I wonder which one. Private voucher programs or supporting public schools. And you can see here from the quote that next year, meaning 2025, they want to get $200 million so that more families of all different socioeconomic backgrounds can get the voucher. And that is problematic because that voucher is $8,000, and that is almost double what our public schools receive for our public school students. And Bagley, says it with an illustration that speaks 1,000 words, that the voucher program will slowly eat away at education funding, public education funding. And that is our huge concern. And we need to have an operational definition of what ballot candy is, because that's what we're seeing on the ballot. And what ballot candy does is it pairs a popular idea with a more controversial one as a way to win votes. And ballot candy is already law, and it distracts from changes. Now I have a link here. This came from the League of Women Voters in Missouri on one of their constitutional amendments. And so I wanted to give credit where credit is due. Statute can be easily changed. I just heard that said. Senator Milner said the same thing in a recent article. So what we're seeing is HB 357, which was the carrot that we, the people and the voters of Utah, were given as far as the 2020 Constitutional Amendment G, was that if you open up the income tax fund for children and individuals with disabilities, meaning social services, we will cover inflation, we will cover student enrollment growth, and we'll create a stabilization account if you pass Constitutional Amendment G. Now, before that, we had to fight to get inflation covered. We had to fight to get student enrollment growth covered, and there wasn't a stabilization account. But now HB 357 is law. So they're saying we need to put it in the Constitution because it can be easily changed. And this will protect public education funding. Well, from what and from whom? Who do we need protection from? Well, we need protection because the HB 357, the statute, can be easily changed. That was an agreement that the legislature made with the voters, and they should honor that agreement. But that's what they're moving into this Constitutional Amendment A with a little bit, a couple other bills that have already been discussed as more incentive, right, to distract us from what would really happen. And we believe what will really happen is you're going to open up the income tax fund to all state needs. And one of those needs that they created in 2023 is the voucher program that they are consistently increasing the revenue for. And HB 394, hold education harmless. That is a recognition that if they don't hold education harmless, public education will be harmed. So here is the language: all state needs and prioritizing public education funding for changes in enrollment and inflation. That is already state law that should be honored, because that was the agreement they made in 2020 with the voters. And then if this amendment is approved, state statute will eliminate the state sales tax on food. That is the latest ballot candy. That is not law yet, but they're saying if you approve Constitutional Amendment A, we will put this statute into policy or into law. So we believe that that is a huge distraction. It is only the state portion of food tax. You're still going to be paying food tax, and they could do that anyway if they had the political will to do that. So we believe this is another power grab. We believe that they're going to take public tax dollars, funnel it to unaccountable private religious school vouchers and politician pet projects. And so this is why we believe it's a good reason why teachers, parents, Republicans, Democrats, Independents stand strongly opposed to Amendment A. So we would like you to vote against Amendment A this November. And if you would like to help us, we can get that information to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Renée. Reminder, if you have questions, chat room's open. I had a question though, so since I'm the moderator, I'm going to ask mine first. Andrea, you mentioned the rainy day fund requirement that is in the provision. Can't remember if it's a statutory provision or constitutional provision. Is that in addition to the existing rainy day funds? I guess there's about $1.2 billion in the combined rainy day funds right now. Would those be expanded, or is this just formalizing the existing status quo?
Yeah, my understanding is that it is an addition. It's specifically for public education rather than the broader rainy day funds for the budget as a whole. But as other presenters have indicated, there's not requirements for any particular amount to be deposited in that fund, just that the fund exists. So that's my understanding.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I guess I was misspeaking earlier. The Q&A section is where you should actually be putting those questions, not in the chat. I apologize for that. So we do have one question here. Why should we trust the legislature to prioritize public education when they have refused to do so, even under the present constitutional constraint of using income tax revenue for public education, higher ed, and students with disabilities? And sort of an ancillary one you can also address maybe is what would be the mechanism that we would think would generate more money for education by removing these constraints? How can removing this constraint translate into more money for education, not less? Billy, why don't you?
I'm assuming that's for me.
Yeah, why don't you take it first, and then we can let
Sure.
everybody else on.
So I would say you need to trust the lawmakers, because this is where you have the opportunity to hold them accountable. You need to let them know that if they do not, live up to the promises that they're making here, and that they do not follow through on funding the education needs that we have in our state, that is going to have, a negative impact on the future of our economy. That's going to have a negative impact on their ability to stay in the legislature, because you're going to work to vote them out. And I would argue that they have prioritized education over the years. I think if you looked at the percentage of state budget that is dedicated to education, it's one of the largest items we have. It's right behind the public health things that we're required to do as a state, but then we then fund education and higher education. It is a priority right now. And it may not be as much as you want it to be, but then that also requires a commitment from all of us that we're willing to pay more. And I think in a time where we're seeing, higher costs of food, higher home housing costs, not sure any of us are too excited right now about the discussion of a higher income tax rate. So right now, I think we're looking for the opportunity to be effective and efficient with what's being collected and ensuring that we are set up for the future. You're gonna have to remind me what the second question was again.
It was one that I sort of added to it, but given that Utah is 50th or 51st in per pupil spending, and we're going to be reducing the sales tax on food if this passes, how would that translate into more money for public education?
Well, I think like I've stated before, the pressure still has to be there. The demand from the public is still going to be there. We, by and large, still have many kids in the public school system, and that it's important to us that this system succeeds. No one wants to see it starve. No one wants to see it fail. We want to see it do amazing things and see our teachers accomplish great things and feel proud of the place where they work. And that's what I believe will cause that natural pressure. All we're asking for is flexibility in a budget, just like we do with a city council when they want to, do an earmark to dedicate a sales tax source strictly for parks. We come back and tell them, you don't really want to do that because you're going to force, all this money to go to parks, but then not have enough to pay your police and firefighters. And then you'll have to raise taxes. We're just saying you want that flexibility so that you can put the money where it's most needed. And I trust that the elected officials will see that our education system's where it's most needed.
Okay, great. Renee, Dixie, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I would say that in 1946, we the people in now I wasn't around them, but Utahns, they wanted public education to be prioritized, and they created a constitutional mandate to do just that. And then in 1996, 50 years later, then they added higher ed and then children and individuals with disabilities. Also, with the HB 215, the voucher bill, one of the lobbyists for that bill was recorded saying, "I want to destroy public education," and that is also something that is connected to this opening up the income tax fund, because we can see 3 years. Or in 2025, the intent to ask for 200 million more. And I would argue that holding our legislators' feet to the fire with the idea that we'll vote them out of office, that has been nullified because of our gerrymandered districts. And so we have a supermajority. That's really hard to do.
Maybe I just also say that it seems to me that it's pretty serious to undo a constitutional mandate. And once you change the language in the Constitution, only the legislature can put it on the ballot to change it again. The right to citizen initiative does not extend to being able to change constitutional language. So I just think it's a far more serious issue. Anytime the legislature is putting amendments to the Constitution up on the ballot, and I think they have not been, I think they've done some recently, too many of them have started showing up, and they get confusing for the public to understand. But Renee gave you some that maybe in retrospect, the public didn't quite understand what they were buying when they allowed the legislature to call itself into special session, for instance. And when it voted for Amendment G to open up what should be quite a lot of flexibility to be able to fund higher ed out of this constitutional mandate and services for children and people with disabilities. I think that's plenty of inroads into the public ed constitutional mandate.
So let me interrupt for just a minute. Some of you are asking questions in the chat rather than the Q&A, and it's actually very difficult for us to follow. So if you would please put your questions in the Q&A, that would help Robert to parse through them. Thank you.
And I apologize for that because I misspoke earlier and told people to put it there. So yes, put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this one because I don't actually. Do you know if this proposal comes through ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conservative group of legislators that meet nationally and take policy proposals and run them in different states?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. My assumption is no, simply because this earmark is unique to Utah. There are not other states that have a constitutional earmark on income tax revenue for public education. So you can see that in the policy brief as well. There are other states that earmark smaller portions of their revenue, but none that have a full earmark like we have. So it would have to be unique to our state.
Okay. Andrea, I'm going to stay with you on this one. This is a question that came in. It says, it's understandable to want to tap into income tax funds when they are growing. What would be the consequences to public education funding if this amendment were to pass and income taxes revenues were to fall?
Yeah, so essentially the legislature is required to balance a budget using all of the revenue sources they have. So there is nothing saying that they could not use other revenue sources to fund public education, but there is no requirement for them to do so. So essentially that would be a legislative decision if revenues were to fall, which programs to prioritize and which, if cuts were needed, which programs to cut. So that's definitely, yeah, just a legislative choice. They could choose to use general fund revenue to fund public education, which has been done in the past. So in those 50 years when 100% of income tax revenue was going to public education, there was also general fund revenue going to public education in years where income tax revenue did not give them as much funding for public ed as they wanted to. So that there is precedent for that, but there's no requirements. So essentially it would be just a legislative decision what to fund and at what level.
Okay, anyone else or should we move on? Okay, so this one came from Tish Brooker. I messed up your name. I'm sorry, Tish. The legislature has managed to present a complicated amendment and is trying to make it seem simple by tagging on the food tax. For me, I will vote no on all amendments until the language again becomes the responsibility of the legal arm of government, not to provide an unbiased amendment, not an amendment crafted by the legislature. I don't know if that's less of a question, but Dixie, you kind of referred to this though, with the Amendment D on ballot initiatives. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, I really don't like the hold harmless bill either. I don't like the food tax bill or the hold harmless bill because Renee called them ballot candy. You know, how do you lure the voter into passing something in order to get these things that they like? And I don't like that as a way of legislative functioning. I think separate bills with separate purposes should be introduced separately. I don't think they should be linked by that. And I think Renee referred to the hold harmless bill. It's a statute which was meant to reassure the public that even if we have declining enrollment, we won't take money away from you for 5 years. But of course, they could change it in the 2025 session if they want to. The statute can be changed anytime by the next legislature. There's nothing binding about it in comparison to monkeying with constitutional provisions.
Yeah, Billy, that's actually a good segue to another question. The sales tax piece of this, the food sales tax on food piece of this, does the Taxpayers Association support that? Would they support it as a standalone? And if it is supported as a standalone, why not run it as a standalone?
Well, I guess to answer the last question first, we'd certainly welcome an opportunity for the voters to vote simply on whether to have the state portion of the sales tax on food removed or not. But that's not what we have before us. What we have is this question. certainly we welcome a tax cut and we welcome relief to Utah's families. As I've mentioned before, we're in an unprecedented time when we have food costing more than it's ever costed. We have, housing costs at higher rates than we've ever expected. We'll look for any way that we can see relief for Utah families to be brought forward. And so, this is one that we'll welcome and hope that it sees its way through.
Anyone else want to address that?
Can I ask Andrea a question?
Yes, please.
Could you please describe for us how much benefit would come to the wealthy and the poor and the in between with removal of the state portion of the sales tax on food?
Sure. So again, like everything we've talked about today, this is a bit of a nuanced question depending on how you look at it. So we looked at it in two ways, essentially, in the policy brief that I shared. One is the actual dollar amount paid in sales tax on food by income decile. And in this, if you're looking at the dollar amount, then there is a larger benefit for higher income households than there is for lower income households. Higher income households spend more money on food because for the most part, they spend more money on everything because they have more money to spend. However, when you look at it as a share of household income, lower income households spend a larger share of their income on food. So if you look at it as a share of income, then there would be a bigger benefit for lower income households than for higher income households. The one complicating factor here is in food benefits. So if people are on SNAP, or what was formerly known as food stamps, or receiving food from a food bank or from a school program, that food is already untaxed. So for those low-income households who are receiving food in those ways, if let's say everyone who was eligible for SNAP was using it, then those lower income households already have relief from the sales tax on food. And in that case, again, the benefit would be more for middle and high income households. So it's a bit of a complicated topic, but that's the nuts and bolts of what we found when we did that analysis.
Renee, you wanted to?
I just ask Andrea a quick question. So if you had $100 that you were spending on groceries, and I think it was 1.75%, how much would you save of that $100?
I mean, $1.75 of
Okay.
that $100. Yeah.
So
the actual total, this is an interesting question because the actual total amount paid per household, I mean, of course, depending on your income level, is not huge. So like the lowest income decile spends like less than $100 a year on sales tax on food, which I'm not saying is nothing because for a lot of families that can be very critical. But it's not, I think it's less than what some people think it is, I guess is the only point I'm trying to make. In the higher income, even the highest income decile, we estimate spends less than $200 on the sales tax on food because this tax is on groceries and food items, not like restaurants and other things. So it's actually it's a smaller portion than I think many people think that it is.
And I think that goes to the point you were making about how for lower income families, the $100 is a larger portion of their income than the $200 or $300 for higher earning families.
Exactly.
So if the issue that's driving this is flexibility in the budget, are there other ways that flexibility could be found, other earmarks that could be found? I know the road funds are all of the gas tax plus a percentage of the sales tax, if I remember right. What other ways are out there that there might be some ways for the legislature to find the flexibility that they want?
That's an excellent question, Robert, and you're correct. The earmarks in the sales taxes for roads are definitely something that is another way we can look at freeing up flexibility within the budget. And it's an option to have on the table. And it's certainly something I'd be open to looking at how we can make sure that those who use the roads are paying for them. I would love to see the legislature look at more aggressively those paths. We're not quite there yet politically. We're not quite there with even our residents to say, hey, let's do a vehicle miles traveled or road usage charge program because no one's quite comfortable with having the government track how many miles we travel within the state. And we probably really need all 50 states to be willing to participate in something like that to accomplish it in an effective manner. But anything we can do to get us to a point where we're depending on the users paying for the roads and not depending on earmarks and sales taxes, I would say is a good thing, and that I hope we'll consider in the future.
Yeah, I can jump in briefly here. We did include in that brief, I mentioned some other options. It's certainly not comprehensive, but just to give an idea of other things that could, you know, the legislature could do to respond to budget flexibility. And one Billy just described very well, I think, is to, you know, replace sales taxes for infrastructure with user fees. This could happen in both transportation and in water, and in other areas in the state. That's one option. The legislature could, of course, always adjust state revenue source composition. So as I kind of referenced earlier, they could reduce the income tax rate, increase property tax rates or sales tax rates. If they want more money in the general fund, which is more flexible money, they could do that. They could always, of course, just limit funding for general fund programs. They could say, well, we only have so much money in the general fund, so the general fund programs are going to receive less funding. They could, this one we included in the brief, but I find it, I don't know, kind of interesting. We said you can always reevaluate flexibility under existing constitutional language. We only bring that up to say that it's nuanced. So for example, a lot of the money that's going to services for children and people with disabilities is going to Medicaid, because a lot of Medicaid funding is spent on children and people with disabilities. You could try to make the argument that kids drive on roads, so you can spend income tax revenue on roads because it's a service for children. I am not recommending that approach, but the point is just to say that there's nuance there. Of course, if you tried to go down that road too far, you'd open yourself up to lawsuits for sure. But mostly the idea is just to say that there are other options. Again, at the Gardner Institute, we wouldn't recommend one option over the other, but just think that it's valuable to consider all of them.
Okay, so Billy, can you walk us through a little bit, and maybe Renee, you might want to address this too. We've seen in the last 5 to 7 years repeated reductions in the income tax rate. I think we started at a little right around 5%, and we're down to, what is it now? 4.65?
4.55 now.
55. And so Renee, do you want to address what that has meant for public education?
Well, as you start to see a decline, and the mandate says all income tax shall be used to support, I don't know that you could really argue with what all means, right? And so as you start to see a decrease in the amount of revenue that is being generated, we know that we have a revenue source. We also know that there's years where we hear there's a surplus. And I've always wondered, how can you have a surplus when all revenue shall be used to support the different groups? So we know that since Constitutional Amendment G was passed, we have seen 6% increases in public education. I believe that was part of the foot in the door strategy. We'll get our foot in the door, open up the income tax fund to children and individuals with disabilities, social services, and then in the next election, part 2, we're going to open it up, right? And allow the income tax revenue to be used for all state needs at the same time that they created this new voucher program. So we know that the amount of money has been decreased because they have surpluses. And I know that there are other groups who have talked about trying to raise the income tax rate, right? And I don't know if that will happen. And I also think that as you talk to legislators, and I know that Representative Peterson said in an article, I think it was KUER, that it would be very difficult as a state to get rid of the income tax. And I believe that that is a true statement. And I also believe, and I'm just going to add right here, that it is a false choice to say we're going to open up the income tax fund to all state needs voucher program. And at the same time, we're going to remove the state food tax, because that is not even a fair choice.
Okay. We've got a couple more in the quick Q&A section. Anybody listening, if you have any questions, go ahead and please put them in there. We've got a little bit more time left. These are more comments. Lynn Carroll says the legislature has been very eager to reduce taxes, and in my estimation, they used to protect themselves from being voted out for breaking promises made in the past. Kind of goes to what Billy was talking about, accountability and at the ballot box. And Christine Holt, for a legislature who pledges to support and uphold the Constitution, it is particularly ironic that in recent years they seek time and after time to change it through constitutional amendments. Doesn't it seem that the reason they are doing so is not in the interest of the people of the state, but rather in their own interests in accumulating more power? And I think that kind of references something that Dixie and Renee both talked about when they called this a power grab. Billy, is this a power grab?
You know, I have a degree in journalism. I don't have a degree in being a CPA or you know, some other thing, that political science or, you know, something else that maybe would be helpful for me in my job. But so naturally, I'm always suspicious of what people are doing and why they're trying to accomplish it. I can't speak to how lowering the income tax or taking a earmark off of it is power grabbing anything, other than to say I think it's allowing for flexibility within the budget and transparency. My hope is that it then shows us really how they're funding the state services that the state is providing, that we really will see how much, you know, income tax is going to public education, how much income tax is going to higher education, and how much income tax might go somewhere else. I believe it'll probably stay about the same as far as funding levels. It just might come from different pots than in the past. But I guess that remains to be seen until we actually see them, you know, put their money where their mouth is, should this amendment pass.
Dixie, do you want to address the power grab issue before we move?
You know, I'd come at it a little differently. These tax decreases, because the revenue source has been growing. I read your brief, I think, Andrea, and I think it said something like since 2015, we've lost $800 million in income tax revenues from the decline in the tax rates that could have been spent on public education or higher ed or children and people with disabilities. And I think part of the issue is people have different definitions of what constitutes an excellent education system in the state, and whether the status quo is enough, whether we're doing enough to keep up with what we're comfortable with. And I remember looking at data that goes back even further. And, you know, when we went from a graduated income tax to a 5% flat tax, it didn't bring in the money that Governor Huntsman had projected. It didn't bring in as much money into the income tax fund as they thought. And that in the years before the recession hit, we were losing money every year that should have been spent on public ed. And I think I want an excellent, well-resourced, safe, equal opportunity for all children to do more than it's currently doing, more than the current status quo. When we have new issues, we have more kids who are English language learners, more refugees. We have more safety issues we didn't have. We have more mental health issues that we didn't have. And to me, we need to be spending more money than just keeping up with growth, which may be flat for a while now, and inflationary increases. So I just, that's where my mind was going from this earlier question you asked.
Okay. We got another question. With the voucher system taking monies out of education, how would there be additional funds? I think that was the point that Renee was touching on. Billy, I think you're going to have to field this one too. I mean, if we're growing the amount spent on vouchers up to 150 million, that money comes from presumably the education fund, right? So if that money's being diverted to a different program, how is that education fund going to grow?
Well, let's be realistic of what's happening already, that they already are using that money, that they already are funding the voucher programs, and who's to say that they won't continue that? But I think that's part of, again, the accountability from the voters. If there really is, people upset about those programs being created and the money being used that way, then the voters need to let their elected officials know that's not what we do here. That's not what we want to have happen in Utah. Or if they're supportive of it, to say, you did make a difference for our family. You helped us succeed, get us the education that we wanted for our student. It's going to be really up to the voters to determine what is the right thing, and not have certain organizations tell them how they feel about it.
And Renee, since this was the issue you raised, do you want to address that as well?
Well,
how expanding the voucher program kind of limits the opportunities for growth.
right, because we don't know how many more millions are going to be siphoned off of public education funding to go towards a voucher program that we know that some people are paying for horseback riding lessons. I understood that a family purchased 4 pianos. There are just a lot of uses for that money, and there isn't any accountability as to if all of these private religious schools, if they are actually educating students at the high levels that our public schools are held to. And it is really just unfathomable that they would try and create a dual education system, private religious schools, as well as public schools, when we have never fully realized a fully funded public education system. And our kids are living in an incredibly complex, complicated time. Every social ill that's out there comes into our classrooms, and our kids are struggling. And we just had a horrific shooting in Georgia, a freshman, 14 years old, that clearly had some issues that they knew about. And we know that our kids, because of general anxiety disorder, depression, suicidal ideation, I have experienced burying more kids than I ever want to. And the teachers for at least one student, who, by the way, lived, I won't go into all those details, but we were the ones on suicide watch. We were the ones watching him and making sure and checking in, teachers. And that's because we do not have enough counselors and social workers, because our kids have a lot of needs, and we need to be able to help them. And we need the funding to be there, and we need more funding for our children.
I'll just add to this discussion, and Andrea, please correct me if I'm wrong, but this was the argument that was made during the voucher debate, was that there's about roughly $12,000 plus per student when you go state, federal, local tax base. And if you take $8,000 out and remove a student, there's $4,000 left behind roughly, because the local portion stays with the local district. So that was the other argument that was made during the voucher debate about how this could actually increase the revenue available to school districts. Now, part of that kind of breaks down a little bit and we don't know the numbers on this. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrea, about how many of the recipients of the vouchers are already in a private school and paying this by themselves. So we don't know exactly how that balance is going to work out. Do I have that about right? Okay. If we have any other Q&As, please put them in. If not, we can start winding down. We'll give a minute to address this. Billy, I'm going to put you on the spot one more time, and maybe Andrea, you can too. Steve Van Maren, so the local district's going to kick out the voucher kids. I'm not sure if I understand that question. It's a voluntary application that they go through to get the voucher to go to a private school. So they would not be in the local district. Andrea, do you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is correct. So this is for people to apply for funds if they are not attending public schools, if they're doing some sort of homeschool, private school, other options. So it's an optional program.
Yeah, okay, it's an opt-in. So this may be an imperfect analogy, and I'll throw it out there and then we can discuss and then we can call it a night. In some ways, if could we look at this as, we've talked about shrinkflation, right? You go to the grocery store and now the 16-ounce bag of chips is 14 ounces, you're paying the same price for it, right? Are we just shrinking the pie with these income tax cuts, sales tax cuts, and then cutting it into more pieces and trying to convince people they're getting the same value for their tax dollar? Billy, you want to take that?
Well, I don't think so. I think we've seen a very large growth in our state budget. I can remember being a Cub reporter 10, 15 years ago, and remember us talking about $12, $13 billion budgets, and we're now talking about a $29 billion state budget. Granted, a good chunk of that is made up of federal dollars, but it's still grown, and we've seen more money come into our state, and so there still is more money available, and that we are spending more on students than we have in the past. And that's where I think we'll continue to see that growth as we continue to invest in our economy, as we continue to invest in students, as we continue to provide the great services that make our state the amazing place it is to live. We're going to continue to see people want to come and want to be part of the Utah experience. And as we grow, that's an increase in the revenues that we will enjoy as a state. And as we see more economic activity happen, that'll increase those revenues as well. There's not one magic lever that's going to fix all the problems. Whether it's we want to lower taxes or we want to make sure that there's a earmark on something. It takes little switches and little turns of the knob to make this state hum the way that it does. And that's what I hope we're looking at here, is just one more flip of a switch or one more turn of a knob to allow for us to continue to move forward as a state and do great things in the future. So I think I've wandered off to a different direction than your question, but
and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the legislative leadership, the number they frequently use is something like $1.3 billion that's been put into public education in the last, I believe, 4 or 5 years. So yeah. So does anybody else want to talk about my pie analogy, my ham-handed pie analogy? The shrinking pie cut into more pieces and saying we're increasing education, or we can call it. All right.
The only thing I will say, and I think Billy kind of made this point, is that technically the pie has not been shrinking because the revenue has grown. So even with income tax rates, we've seen increased income tax revenue over the years. However, I think your analogy stands as far as what the income tax revenue is used for, that pie is being sliced into more and more pieces over time. So that's all I'll say.
All right. Well, I'll applaud you guys. Thank you for taking the time to do this. As you may know, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning, the webinar was recorded, so it will be online at LWV.org, along with I believe we'll be posting Andrea's brief and probably Dixie's as well, right? And a host of other information, not just about Amendment A, Amendment D, about how to register to vote, and candidate information. So LWV.org with League of Women Voters. And thanks, Catherine and Peggy for putting this together. And thank you guys all for participating.
Robert, it's actually LWVUtah.org.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's okay. You can make that a little, we could be national.
LWVUtah.org, LWVUtah.org for all of your election related information. And thank you guys again for participating. And thanks for everybody who tuned in. Have a good night.